Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. So today we are going to study about the muscles of the anterolateral abdominal wall. Now the anterolateral abdominal wall actually houses the major three broad thin sheets of muscles that are external oblique, internal oblique and transversus abdominis. And of all these three muscles, the muscular part is most pronounced laterally, and then they become aponeurotic anteriorly or medially. You can visualize this from the picture of atlas. Here you can see that of all these three muscles, the muscular part is, that is the reddish part here, is most pronounced laterally, and then they are becoming aponeurotic. Aponeurosis means a flat sheet-like layer of dense connective tissue. That means it is actually similar to tendon. So that's why it is shown white here, and that muscle is becoming more of the aponeurotic in the anterior or medial area. Okay. Now let's come back to our topic. Now what is the basically arrangement of these three layers? So basically the first, superficially we are going to have the external oblique, then we are going to have the internal oblique, and then deep to the internal oblique we are going to have the transversus abdominis muscles. Now the arrangement of these three muscles is actually equivalent, or you can say in correspondence with the arrangement of the intercostal muscles. In the same way we have the external intercostal, internal intercostal. So in that same way we also have the external oblique, internal oblique and transversus abdominis. Now there is additionally another paired muscle, that is the rectus abdominis muscle, that is present, you can say, more of in the anterior midline area, and that is vertically actually, and is in the form of the wide vertical straps that are extending from the subcostal plane and ending up to the pelvic area. Now, as the aponeurosis of three sheets pass forward, as you know that the fibers of these muscles are actually coming more forward. Like you can also visualize this, that these muscles are actually coming forward and anteriorly. So as the aponeurosis of these three muscles comes forward and join at the linea alba. Linea alba is actually the line where all the three aponeuroses of the three muscles, or you can say this, they are three paired muscles which are meeting. The midline here is called the linea alba. Here in the center, this line is called. So actually the aponeurosis of all these three paired muscles are meeting here, and here they are going to surround the rectus abdominis muscle. And the rectus abdominis muscle, while enclosing the rectus abdominis muscle, they are going to form a sheath that is called the rectus sheath. Now in the lower part of the rectus sheath we also have a small muscle present, and that can be present, and that is called the pyramidalis. Okay. Now we will start with separately with each muscle. Okay, so first we are going to start with the external oblique muscle. Actually we are going in the same way in the way that there is the arrangement of muscles. Okay, now in the anterior abdominal wall, the most superficial muscle is the below the deep fascia is external oblique. Now where is the origin of external oblique? So the origin of external oblique is from the lower 8 ribs. Now what are the lower 8 ribs? That means from the ribs 5 up to the rib number 12. That is actually the origin of the external oblique. And where is going to be the insertion of the external oblique? So the insertion of the external oblique is up to the xiphoid process, linea alba, that is the midline anteriorly, the pubic crest, on the pubis, the pubic tubercle, in the you can say in the midline inferiorly, and the iliac crest. Here you can visualize the insertions of the muscles from a diagram. Now here you can visualize the insertions of the external oblique. Now as you can see, the external oblique is, this one muscle is the external oblique. This figure A is actually representing the external oblique, and you can also see the fibers. These fibers are more of coming forward and anteriorly and downward. Like these are forward, anteriorly and downward. If you notice these lines, these black light lines. Okay, so the insertion of the external obliques is actually on the xiphoid process, then on the linea alba. This is actually the linea alba because we are viewing the picture from the lateral view, and then on the pubic crest. This is the pubic crest. Then on the pubic tubercle. Pubic tubercle is little lateral to the pubic crest. If you have studied the pubis, you should know. Then this is the iliac crest, here. So these are the basically 4 insertion points of the external oblique. Now let's come back to our topic. The next thing is about the nerve supply of the external oblique muscle. Okay. Now the nerve supply, the general nerve supply we have already discussed in the previous lecture of the abdomen, anterolateral abdomen. We have already discussed the nerve supply, general nerve supply, and the nerve supply of the external oblique is that's why going to be exactly same. The lower 6 thoracic nerves and the iliohypogastric and ilioinguinal nerves, as you already know, iliohypogastric and ilioinguinal nerves are actually the L1 nerves. Okay, so the lower 6 thoracic nerves and the iliohypogastric and ilioinguinal nerves are the nerve supply of the external oblique. Now what is basically the function of the external oblique? So external oblique basically stores our abdominal contents. Okay, and then it also, while contraction, it also compresses the abdominal contents. That means it is going to assist in the flexion and the rotation of the trunk. That means when we move downward to pick an object, so during that movement the external oblique muscle is actually compressing our abdominal contents, so that prevent them from falling in the front because there is no bony framework. Okay, now it also assists in the forced expiration during respiration, and then in micturition. Micturition is actually called the urination or voiding, and also in the defecation reflex, and the parturition. Parturition is actually called the childbirth or labor, and in vomiting. So these are all the actions of the external oblique. Now let's study external oblique further in detail. So the external oblique is actually a broad, thin, muscular sheet with most of its fibers inserting by a means of wider aponeurosis, as we have already visualized this in the picture of atlas, that most of its fibers are actually inserting in the form of aponeurosis on the xiphoid, linea alba, pubic crust and the iliac crust. They are inserting in the form of by forming a aponeurosis, that is a flat sheet like layer of dense connective tissue like tendon. Okay, that is called the aponeurosis. Now the most posterior fibers that are passing down to the iliac crust, they are usually forming a posterior free border. So here you can see the posterior free borders of the external oblique, and they are actually forming a free border here at the level of iliac crust. Okay. Now there is also a triangular shaped defect in the external oblique aponeurosis, and that part of aponeurosis that lies immediately above and medial to the pubic tubercle. On that part there is a triangular defect, or you can say opening in the external oblique aponeurosis, and that triangular shaped defect is actually going to form a ring that is called the superficial inguinal ring, and that ring is so important in the during the spermatic cord process. So the spermatic cord or the round ligament of uterus, the spermatic cord is in the case of males and the round ligament of uterus is present in the case of females, that actually passes through this opening of the that is called the superficial inguinal ring, and then while passing through the superficial inguinal ring, it actually carries and you can say extend or pinch off the fibers of the external oblique, forming an external spermatic fascia that surrounds the spermatic cord or the round ligament of uterus. Okay. Now let's further move ahead. Here you can see in this big diagram that these are actually the here is shown the spermatic cord, and this triangular shaped defect here shown is the superficial inguinal ring, and this cord which is carrying the arteries and the vas deferens, this is actually called the spermatic cord. And this spermatic cord, while passing through the superficial inguinal ring, it is actually carrying and extending the fibers of the aponeurosis of the external oblique, and that aponeurosis is now called the external spermatic fascia. That aponeurosis was actually the part of external oblique aponeurosis, but now while covering the spermatic cord, it is called the external spermatic fascia. Okay. Now the lower border of the aponeurosis is folded backward on itself between the anterior superior iliac spine and the pubic tubercle. So actually the lower border of the aponeurosis of the external oblique is folding backward on itself. That was the free border, and that is actually folding between the anterior superior iliac spine of the iliac bone and the pubic tubercle of the pubic bone, and and that thickening is actually going to form the inguinal ligament. Here you can visualize the inguinal ligament. So actually inguinal ligament is the thickening of the external oblique aponeurosis fibers between the anterior superior iliac spine up to the pubic tubercle. These fibers of the aponeurosis, they are actually going to fold backward on themselves and they are going to form a thick ligament. That ligament is called the inguinal ligament, and that extends from the anterior superior iliac spine to the pubic tubercle. That are actually the insertions of the external oblique aponeurosis. Okay, so now the inguinal ligament is also called the Poppert's ligament. Okay, now the inguinal ligament, when it comes medially up to the pubic tubercle, here up to the pubic tubercle, it is going to fold back and it is going to curve, and this curved part of the inguinal ligament is now called the lacunar's ligament. Okay, so this is going to form the lacunar ligament, and the lacunar ligament is also called the Gimbernett's ligament. So lacunar ligament is actually the modification of the inguinal ligament. The inguinal ligament is going to curve backward and curved laterally, and this curved part is called the lacunar ligament. Now the lacunar ligament is going to continue posteriorly and it is going to continue up to the pectineal line of the iliac bone. Okay, superior ramus of the pubic bone, and that at the pectineal line, that lacunar or inguinal ligament is actually going to fuse with the periosteum of the pectineal line, and here it is going to form the ligament that is called the pectineal ligament. Now the pectineal ligament is also called the Cooper's ligament. So actually the pectineal ligament, lacunar's ligament are, you can say, actually the extensions of the inguinal ligament, or you can say more of the modifications of the inguinal ligament. Now some part of the inguinal ligament medially is going to reflect upward and is going to attach to the linea alba anteriorly or upward, and that part is called the reflected part of the inguinal ligament. So we actually have three modifications of the inguinal ligament. One is the lacunar ligament, other is the pectineal ligament, and third is the reflected part of the inguinal ligament. Okay, now let's read this from the textbook. The lacunar ligament extends backward and upward from the medial end of the inguinal ligament to the pectineal line on the superior ramus of the pubis, and here when it is curved, it is going to form a medial margin or a free crescentric edge that is going to form the medial margin of the femoral ring. Now you can visualize this from a diagram of the Snell's. Here you can visualize this, that this is the actually inguinal ligament that is actually extending from the anterior superior iliac spine up to the pubic tubercle. Now near the pubic tubercle, these fibers are actually going to curve backward and they are going to form a crescentric edge. As you can visualize this, they are going to form a crescentric edge, and this crescentric edge is actually going to form the medial margin of the femoral ring. The femoral ring, we have already discussed the femoral ring in the lower limb part. Okay, so the medial margin of the femoral ring is actually formed by the lacunar ligament, and lacunar ligament is actually the modification of the inguinal ligament. Okay, now let's come back to our topic. Okay, on reaching the pectineal line, we are now talking about the lacunar's ligament. On reaching the pectineal line, the lacunar ligament becomes continuous with the thickening of the periosteum, which I have already mentioned, and now this part is going to form the pectineal ligament. So the pectineal ligament is actually the modification of the inguinal ligament. You can also visualize this from the diagram, that now this lacunar ligament is going backward, and this is the pectineal line. Okay, on the superior ramus of the pubis, this is the pectineal line, and here the pectineal ligament is going to continue, or you can becomes continuous with the covering or thickening of the periosteum, and this is going to form the pectineal ligament. So the inguinal ligament, the curved part is called the lacunar ligament, and then it is going up and becoming continuous with the pectineal line, and that part is going to be called the pectineal ligament. So that was about the inguinal ligament. Now basically the lateral part of the posterior edge of the inguinal ligament, it is going to give origin to the part of the internal oblique and transversus abdominis muscle. So actually they are saying the lateral part, or you can say more of the posterior part, that is actually inserting to the iliac crest, this part here, that the lateral part. That lateral part of the inguinal ligament is actually going to give origin to the some part of the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscles, which we are going to discuss afterwards. Okay, and then again the deep fascia of the thigh, that is called the fascia lata. We have already discussed in the previous lecture about the fascia lata in the superficial fascia of the anterolateral abdominal wall. So actually the deep fascia of the thigh is called the fascia lata, and the fascia lata is coming upward and it is going to attach on the posterior, or you can say inferior rounded border of the inguinal ligament. The inferior rounded border of the inguinal ligament is actually going to give attachment to the fascia lata, but on superiorly the lateral part of the inguinal ligament is going to give origin to the muscles that are the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscles. Okay, now let's continue with the internal oblique muscle. So the internal oblique is actually deep to the external oblique, immediately after the external oblique, and the origin of the internal oblique is from the lumbar fascia. Lumbar fascia is actually posteriorly iliac crest and lateral 2/3 of the inguinal ligament, which we have discussed right now just before starting the internal oblique, that the lateral 2/3 of the inguinal ligament is actually going to give origin to some part of the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscle. Okay, so there will be no confusion about the origin of the internal oblique. Now let's move towards the insertion of the internal oblique. So the insertion of the internal oblique is from the to the lower 3 ribs, that are ribs 9 to 12 and their respective costal cartilages, and xiphoid process, linea alba, and it is also going to attach on the pubic symphysis. Pubic symphysis is actually the point where the two pubic bones from the opposite side are meeting in the front. Okay, now the nerve supply is actually again from the lower 6 thoracic nerves and the L1 nerves, that are iliohypogastric and ilioinguinal nerves, and its function is same as the external oblique, that it is going to support the abdominal content, and it is also going to assist in the flexion and rotation of the trunk by compressing our abdominal content, so that it gives a tone to the abdomen, and it also assists in the expiration, forced expiration, specifically maturation, defecation, parturition, and the vomiting. Now let's see the internal oblique in further detail. So the internal oblique muscle is again also a broad thin muscular sheet like that of the external oblique, but it is deep to the external oblique, and there is one difference, that the fibers of the external oblique, we see that they were coming downward and forward, but the fibers of the internal oblique are actually at the right angles to those of the external oblique, and they are going to radiate upward and forward. Okay, so that's the difference. The fibers of the external oblique were coming downward and forward, and the fibers of the internal oblique are going to radiate upward and forward. And again the muscular part of the internal oblique will be more prominent laterally, and medially we will have the, and the medial part will be more of the aponeurosis type. Here you can also visualize in the atlas image that the fibers of the external oblique are coming downward and forward, and then they are forming joining from the opposite sides at the linea alba, but the fibers of the internal oblique will be coming upward. Here you can see the internal oblique muscle and the internal oblique aponeurotic part shown here, and basically their fibers are more of coming forward and upward. Okay, the external oblique were coming forward and downward, and they are coming forward and upward, the fibers of the internal oblique. Now let's move back to our main topic. So the internal oblique again has a lower free border, but the lower free border of the internal oblique is going to arch over the spermatic cord, because you know the spermatic cord have already entered from the superficial inguinal ring in the external oblique. Okay, so now it is going to pass beneath the internal oblique, so the internal oblique fibers and their lower free fibers will have to be arched over the spermatic cord or the round ligament of uterus, and then after arching or curving they are going to descend behind it and going to attach to the pubic crest and the pectineal line posteriorly. Now we are also going to visualize this from a diagram of Snell's. Here you can see These are actually the internal oblique muscle fibers, and the internal oblique muscle fibers are actually arching over the spermatic cord. Here the spermatic cord is shown, and the fibers of the internal oblique are actually arching over the spermatic cord, and then they are descending backward and going to attach on the pubic tubercle and the pectineal line, as you are saying, and also on the linea alba, some part on the linea alba. Now near their insertion, as you can see, near their insertion, the lowest tendinous fibers, are going to be joined by the similar fibers from the transversus abdominis muscle. Here this muscle is the transversus abdominis muscle, and at near their insertion, their lower fibers are actually joined, and they are becoming a conjoining with each other, and they are going to attach at the linea alba, and this part is called the conjoined tendon. So conjoined tendon includes what? It includes the arched fibers of the internal oblique, the aponeurosis, their aponeurotic path, and the arched fibers of the transversus muscles, their lowest fibers. So actually the lower arched fibers of the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscle, near their insertion to the linea alba, they are going to form a tendon that is called the conjoined tendon. So medially it is going to be attached to the linea alba, but laterally, as you can see here, laterally it is free. So medially they are attached, but laterally they are going to be free. So that was about the internal oblique, but still we have been left with a point, and that is about the cremasteric muscle. Now, as the spermatic cord passes under the lower border of the internal oblique, it carries some muscle fibers again. It is going to like that of external oblique. It is again, the spermatic cord is again going to carry some fibers that are derived from the internal oblique, and that fibers of the internal oblique that are going to now surround the spermatic cord, now they are going to constitute a muscle, and that muscle is called the cremaster muscle. So cremaster muscle is actually a modification of what? A modification of the internal oblique muscle. Now there is some commonly asked question that the spermatic cord was in the external oblique was passing through the superficial inguinal ring, but there is no ring in the internal oblique. So actually there is no need to be of some ring in the internal oblique, because we have already studied that the internal oblique fibers are actually going to arch over the spermatic cord. So the spermatic cord is not like that it is going to pass through the internal oblique. No, it is actually passing beneath the internal oblique, but the spermatic cord already was passing through the external oblique. That's why there was a defect or opening in the external oblique, but in internal oblique this is passing beneath the internal oblique, so there is no need of any opening. The internal oblique fibers are actually going to arch over the spermatic cord, and that is going to give the spermatic cord enough pathway to pass. Okay, now the cremasteric fascia is actually the cremaster muscle plus the fascia that is going to be surround the cremaster muscle. It is called the cremasteric fascia. And what is the function of this muscle in the spermatic cord? So actually the cremaster muscle, it exerts tension, okay, on the spermatic cord, and it helps in raising or lowering the testes. Okay, it helps in the movement of the testes, the cremaster muscle. So that was all about the internal oblique muscle. Now we are going to move toward the transversus abdominis muscle. So the origin of the transversus abdominis muscle is again from the lower 6 costal cartilages, that means from the rib 6 to rib 12 costal cartilages, and from the lumbar fascia, from the iliac crust posteriorly, and from the lateral third of the inguinal ligament. Now that is the difference point between the internal oblique and transversus abdominis origin. The internal oblique was actually originating from the lateral 2/3 part of the inguinal ligament, but the transversus abdominis is actually going to originate from the lateral 1/3 part of the inguinal ligament. Okay. Now about the insertion, its insertion is again on the xiphoid process, linea alba, that is the midline anteriorly, and on the pubic symphysis. And the nerve supply of all the three muscles are again same, the lower 6 thoracic nerves and the L1 nerves, that are iliohypogastric and ilioinguinal nerves. And its action is that it compresses abdominal contents during the movement of the trunk. Okay. Now let's see the transversus abdominis muscle in further detail. So the transversus abdominis is again a thin sheet of muscle like that of external and internal oblique, and it actually lies deep to the internal oblique, and its fibers run horizontally forward. Now that is again the key difference between the external oblique, internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscle fibers. As you can see, now here the transversus abdominis muscle is intact and the other two muscles are cut. Now you can see the fibers of the transversus abdominis muscle. So the fibers of the transversus abdominis muscles, they are actually running horizontally forward, but we have already discussed that the fibers of the internal oblique are actually running or radiating forward and upward, but the fibers of the external oblique were actually radiating forward and downward. So that is the difference. The fibers of the external oblique are running forward and downward, internal oblique are running forward and upward, but that of the transversus abdominis fibers are actually running horizontally forward. Okay. And again the lowest tendinous fibers are again arching over the spermatic cord, and you can say they are joining the similar fibers from the internal oblique near the linea alba or near the pubic crest midline, and they are going to form a tendon that is called the conjoint tendon, and that conjoint tendon is medially fixed to the linea alba, but laterally it is free, and it is fixed to the pubic crest and the pectineal line posteriorly. Okay. Now note that the posterior borders of the external oblique muscle was free, because the external oblique muscle was actually not attaching backward to the lumbar vertebra. It was actually free. It was not attaching with the lumbar fascia posteriorly, but the posterior borders or fibers of the internal oblique and transversus abdominis muscles, they are not actually free. They are attached to the lumbar vertebra by the lumbar fascia, and we have discussed this point while we were discussing internal oblique, and again we are discussing while we are discussing transversus abdominis. Now I am also going to make this memory or make this concept solid clear to you by a diagram. Now here you can visualize that point. So here you can see the external oblique muscle posterior fibers are actually free. They are not attaching to the lumbar vertebra or lumbar fascia, but the fibers of the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscle, you can see that they are attaching to basically the lumbar fascia. They are the green part that is present posteriorly to the internal oblique and also to the transversus muscle. That means these two muscles are attaching with the lumbar fascia, and they are going to attach correspondingly with the lumbar vertebra, but the external oblique muscles are not attaching posteriorly with the lumbar fascia. Okay, so that was all about the three muscles of the anterolateral abdominal wall. Now the remaining muscle, that is the rectus abdominis muscle and the rectus sheath and the transversalis fascia, we are going to discuss in the next part of the anterolateral abdominal wall muscles.